The Australian general looked across the table at the American officers with undisguised contempt. Thomas Blamey had seen combat in 2 world wars. He'd commanded men at Gallipoli when some of these Americans were still in diapers. Now, in early 1942, as Japan swept through the Pacific like an unstoppable typhoon, this grizzled veteran was being told that fresh American troops would reinforce his positions in New Guinea. Blamey's response would echo through military history. The Americans, he declared with a dismissive laugh, were too soft for jungle warfare. Too pampered. Too inexperienced. They would crumble in the green hell of New Guinea's mountains and swamps, where Japanese soldiers were already proving themselves as some of the most fanatical and deadly fighters the world had ever seen. General Douglas MacArthur heard about Blamey's assessment. And MacArthur, whose ego was as legendary as his military genius, whose promises to the Philippine people still rang in his ears, whose determination to redeem himself after the fall of Corregidor consumed every waking moment, made a decision that would define the Pacific War. If Blamey thought Americans were too soft, MacArthur would prove him catastrophically wrong. He would give the Americans New Guinea. All of it. Every mosquito-infested swamp, every disease-ridden valley, every mountain ridge crawling with Japanese machine gun nests. The Americans would take the lead. And they would show the world, show the skeptical Australians, show the arrogant Japanese, exactly what American soldiers could do when pushed to their absolute limits. What followed was not just a military campaign. It was a descent into hell. A brutal, savage, no-quarter-given war of annihilation that would rage across one of the most hostile environments on Earth. In the jungles and mountains of New Guinea, over 170,000 Japanese soldiers would meet their deaths. Most would never fire a shot at an American. They would die of starvation, disease, exposure, and madness as MacArthur's strategy systematically destroyed entire Japanese armies without the need for costly frontal assaults. This is the story of how American soldiers, dismissed as too soft for jungle warfare, instead became the architects of one of the most complete military victories in history. A story of innovation, adaptation, and a ruthlessness that shocked even hardened combat veterans. A story that began with mocking laughter and ended with silence, the kind of silence that descends over a graveyard. In January 1942, the situation in the Pacific was beyond desperate. It was catastrophic. The Japanese had achieved in 3 months what military experts thought impossible. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. The Philippines were falling. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, had surrendered in the most humiliating defeat in British military history. The Dutch East Indies were collapsing. Burma was being overrun. And New Guinea, that massive, primitive island just north of Australia, was next on Japan's list. If Japan secured New Guinea, they could launch bombing raids on Australian cities. They could cut the supply lines between America and Australia. They could potentially force Australia out of the war entirely, leaving the United States isolated in the Pacific, forced to defend a 6,000-mile perimeter with a navy still recovering from Pearl Harbor. The Japanese understood New Guinea's strategic value. So did MacArthur. But there was a problem. A massive, seemingly insurmountable problem. New Guinea wasn't just an island. It was a geographic nightmare that made other Pacific islands look like pleasant vacation spots. Imagine mountains that soared over 15,000 feet, covered in jungle so thick that sunlight never reached the ground. Imagine swamps where men could sink to their waists in mud that sucked at their boots with every step. Imagine heat so oppressive that soldiers would collapse from heatstroke in minutes. Imagine rain that fell not in drops but in solid sheets, turning everything into a slippery, moldy nightmare. Imagine insects, millions of insects, mosquitoes that carried malaria, dengue fever, and diseases that didn't even have names. Imagine leeches that attached themselves to every exposed inch of skin. Imagine crocodiles, venomous snakes, and tropical ulcers that could rot a man's leg to the bone in days. Now imagine fighting a war in that environment. Against an enemy that had already proven themselves masters of jungle warfare. Against soldiers who believed surrender was the ultimate dishonor, who would fight to the death rather than face the shame of capture. Against an imperial Japanese army that had conquered half of Asia and showed no signs of stopping. This was the challenge facing American forces in early 1942. And according to General Blamey, they simply weren't up to it. The Australians had already been fighting in New Guinea. They'd faced the Japanese at places like Kokoda, engaging in some of the most brutal combat of the war. They'd seen Japanese soldiers charge machine gun positions with samurai swords. They'd witnessed banzai attacks that defied all military logic. They'd discovered enemy soldiers who'd been ordered to hold positions and did so even after being bypassed, surviving on roots and insects for months, still ready to ambush unwary patrols. The Australians were tough, hardened by their own frontier history. Many had fought in North Africa against Rommel's Afrika Korps. They viewed themselves as superior jungle fighters, adapted to harsh conditions. And when they looked at American troops, many fresh from training camps in the States, they saw soft, inexperienced soldiers who would break at the first real contact with the enemy. Blamey's dismissive assessment wasn't entirely without foundation. Many American soldiers in early 1942 were green, untested. They'd trained in the deserts of California or the forests of Georgia, not in anything resembling New Guinea's hellish environment. They'd never faced an enemy as fanatical as the Japanese. They'd never experienced the psychological horror of jungle combat, where the enemy could be 3 feet away and completely invisible, where every shadow might conceal a sniper, where every rustle in the undergrowth might signal an ambush. But Blamey made a critical mistake. He underestimated American adaptability. He underestimated American industrial might. And most importantly, he underestimated Douglas MacArthur's determination to prove the doubters wrong. MacArthur's response to Blamey's skepticism was characteristically bold. "Fine," he essentially said. "You think Americans can't handle jungle warfare? Watch this." The Americans would take the lead in New Guinea. They would conduct the primary offensive operations. They would face the bulk of the Japanese forces. And they would do it MacArthur's way, using tactics and strategies that would revolutionize Pacific warfare. The first major test came at Buna and Gunna, 2 heavily fortified Japanese positions on New Guinea's northeastern coast. In late 1942, American and Australian forces launched an assault that both sides expected to be brief. The Japanese had perhaps 5,000 defenders. The Allies had superior numbers, air superiority, and naval support. It should have been straightforward. It wasn't. It was a nightmare. The Japanese had constructed bunkers from coconut logs that were impervious to everything except direct hits from heavy artillery. They'd created interlocking fields of fire that turned every advance into a suicide mission. They'd positioned machine guns in positions that couldn't be flanked, couldn't be bypassed, could only be taken by frontal assault across open ground. American soldiers, many in combat for the first time, were thrown into attacks that resembled World War I's Western Front more than anything they'd trained for. They charged Japanese positions and were cut down in waves. They tried to dig in but found the water table just inches below the surface, making foxholes impossible. They attempted to use grenades but the thick jungle absorbed the blasts. They called for air support but the jungle canopy was so dense that pilots couldn't see targets. Men died by the hundreds. Malaria rates exceeded 100% in some units, meaning soldiers caught the disease multiple times. Dysentery turned entire companies into shambling wrecks. Tropical ulcers ate through skin and muscle. Soldiers went mad from the stress, the heat, the constant threat of death from invisible enemies. And through it all, MacArthur demanded results. He relieved commanders who failed to make progress. He ordered attacks that experienced officers knew were suicidal. He seemed willing to accept any casualty rate to achieve victory. Some historians would later accuse him of callousness, of treating soldiers as expendable pieces on a strategic chessboard. But something remarkable was happening. The Americans were learning. Every attack, even the failed ones, taught lessons. Officers who survived began to understand jungle tactics. They learned to use flamethrowers against bunkers. They discovered that tanks, even light tanks, could provide crucial support if used correctly. They realized that bypassing strong points and cutting supply lines was more effective than frontal assaults. They adapted their tactics, their equipment, their entire approach to warfare. By the time Buna and Gunna fell in January 1943, after 2 months of savage fighting, the Americans who'd survived were no longer the soft, inexperienced troops Blamey had mocked. They were hardened jungle fighters who'd learned their lessons in the harshest school imaginable. They'd proven they could fight and win in conditions that would have broken lesser forces. But the victory at Buna and Gunna was just the beginning. MacArthur had studied the campaign carefully. He'd seen the horrific casualties from frontal assaults. He'd watched disease kill more men than Japanese bullets. And he'd developed a new strategy, one that would define the rest of the Pacific War. MacArthur called it leapfrogging. Others called it island hopping. The Japanese would later call it something else entirely: systematic annihilation. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Instead of attacking every Japanese stronghold, MacArthur would bypass them. He would use air and naval superiority to identify weak points in Japanese defenses, then land forces behind the main enemy concentrations, cutting their supply lines and leaving them to wither and die. The Japanese had prepared for the kind of warfare they understood. Fierce battles for every inch of ground, banzai charges, last stands that would bloody the Americans so badly they'd lose the will to continue. They'd built massive fortifications at places like Rabaul, concentrating over 100,000 troops in positions they believed were impregnable. MacArthur ignored Rabaul entirely. He bypassed it, landed forces at locations the Japanese had left lightly defended, and established new bases that rendered Rabaul strategically irrelevant. The Japanese garrison at Rabaul, one of the largest concentrations of enemy forces in the Pacific, spent the rest of the war isolated, cut off, slowly starving, unable to affect the war's outcome in any way. This strategy was replicated across New Guinea. At La and Salamaua, MacArthur feinted toward one objective while landing the main force at another. At Hollandia, he bypassed 3 entire Japanese divisions, landing 80,000 American troops 500 miles behind enemy lines. The Japanese forces that were bypassed, numbering tens of thousands of men, found themselves trapped in the jungle with no supplies, no reinforcements, no hope. What happened next was something that military historians still struggle to fully comprehend. These bypassed Japanese forces didn't surrender. Surrender was not an option for Japanese soldiers indoctrinated with Bushido code. Instead, they attempted to reach other Japanese positions, marching through hundreds of miles of jungle, carrying whatever supplies they could scavenge. Most never made it. They died in the jungle, one by one, victims of starvation, disease, exhaustion, and despair. Some were reduced to cannibalism. Others went insane. Allied patrols would occasionally encounter these remnants, skeletal figures in rotting uniforms, more ghosts than soldiers, still clutching rifles they no longer had the strength to fire. The scale of Japanese losses in New Guinea is difficult to grasp. Of approximately 200,000 Japanese soldiers who served in New Guinea during the war, over 170,000 died. But here's the crucial detail that demonstrates MacArthur's strategic genius. The vast majority didn't die in combat. They died because MacArthur had rendered combat unnecessary. He'd created a situation where entire Japanese armies simply ceased to exist as effective fighting forces without the need for costly battles. American casualties, while still significant, were a fraction of what they would have been using conventional tactics. Instead of attacking fortified positions head-on, American forces bypassed them. Instead of fighting for every mile of jungle, they used air and naval mobility to strike where the enemy was weakest. Instead of matching Japanese fanaticism with equivalent sacrifice, they used intelligence, logistics, and operational flexibility to make Japanese fanaticism irrelevant. The campaign also saw innovations that would define modern warfare. MacArthur's forces used air transport on a scale never before attempted, flying entire divisions over mountain ranges that would have taken weeks to cross on foot. They developed techniques for amphibious landings that would be used in every subsequent Pacific campaign. They pioneered the use of code talkers, with Navajo soldiers providing unbreakable communications. They created mobile surgical hospitals that dramatically improved survival rates for wounded soldiers. But perhaps most importantly, they proved that American soldiers could not only match Japanese troops in jungle warfare but exceed them. The transformation was remarkable. Soldiers who'd arrived in New Guinea as inexperienced replacements became expert jungle fighters. They learned to move silently through the undergrowth. They mastered ambush tactics. They became adept at using the terrain to their advantage. They developed a healthy respect for their enemy while losing all fear of them. There were moments of incredible heroism. At the Battle of Lone Tree Hill, American soldiers assaulted a Japanese position that dominated the surrounding terrain. The Japanese had fortified it brilliantly, with bunkers carved into solid rock, fields of fire that covered every approach. American commanders estimated it would take days to capture, with hundreds of casualties. A single American squad, led by a sergeant who'd survived Buna, found an alternate route up the hill's rear slope. They climbed at night, carrying nothing but rifles and grenades, moving in absolute silence. At dawn, they attacked the Japanese positions from behind, creating chaos that allowed the main American force to advance. The sergeant died in the assault, but his actions saved hundreds of American lives and shortened the battle from days to hours. There were also moments of horror that revealed the war's true savagery. Japanese soldiers, facing starvation in bypassed positions, began attacking native villages for food. The atrocities committed were so severe that local tribes, who'd initially been neutral, actively began helping American forces hunt down isolated Japanese units. The jungle warfare became even more brutal, with no quarter given by either side. American soldiers discovered that wounded Japanese soldiers would often pretend to surrender, then detonate grenades when Americans approached to provide medical aid. The lesson was learned quickly and brutally. American units stopped taking prisoners in some areas. Wounded Japanese were shot where they lay. The rules of civilized warfare, already strained, broke down entirely in New Guinea's green hell. Disease remained a constant enemy for both sides. Malaria was endemic. At peak periods, 90% of American soldiers in some units were infected, though continued fighting while taking massive doses of quinine and later atabrine. The atabrine turned their skin yellow, giving them a jaundiced appearance that made them look as sick as many of them felt. But they kept fighting. Japanese forces had it worse. Cut off from supply lines, they had no access to anti-malarial drugs. Disease ravaged their bypassed units. Allied intelligence officers, interrogating the few prisoners who were captured, learned of entire Japanese companies that had ceased to exist as fighting forces, with survivors too weak from malaria and dysentery to even carry their weapons. The tropical ulcers were perhaps worse than malaria. A simple scratch could become infected in the humid jungle environment. Within days the infection would spread, eating through skin and muscle. Without proper medical treatment, amputation was often the only option. Japanese soldiers, lacking medical supplies, would sometimes attempt self-amputation using their bayonets. The psychological trauma of watching your own body rot while still alive drove many to suicide. MacArthur's forces advanced relentlessly up the New Guinea coast, each landing bringing them closer to the Philippines, closer to MacArthur's promised return. The Japanese high command recognized what was happening but seemed powerless to stop it. They'd committed massive forces to New Guinea, believing it would be the decisive battlefield. Instead, those forces were being systematically destroyed or rendered irrelevant while barely slowing the American advance. At 8 American forces landed and established a defensive perimeter. Japanese commanders, finally recognizing the need to contest these landings, assembled a force of 20,000 soldiers and launched a massive counterattack. It was one of the few times in the New Guinea campaign where the Japanese attempted a conventional battle on American terms. The result was a slaughter. American forces, now experienced in jungle warfare, had prepared defensive positions using lessons learned from previous battles. They'd positioned artillery to cover likely Japanese approach routes. They'd established interlocking fields of fire. They'd created kill zones that Japanese attackers had to cross under withering fire. When the Japanese attacked, they did so with their traditional ferocity. Banzai charges crashed against American positions in wave after wave. Japanese soldiers, screaming battle cries, charged into machine gun fire with bayonets fixed. Some reached American positions and engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat. But the outcome was never in doubt. American firepower was overwhelming. Artillery barrages turned jungle into moonscape. Machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red. Mortars dropped shells with precision that decimated Japanese formations before they could even reach American lines. In 3 days of intense fighting, the Japanese lost over 10,000 men. American casualties were measured in hundreds. The Battle of 8 demonstrated conclusively that American forces had not only adapted to jungle warfare but had mastered it. The soldiers Blamey had dismissed as too soft had become an efficient killing machine that could outfight Japanese troops even when the Japanese chose the time and place of battle. By mid-1944, the New Guinea campaign was effectively over. MacArthur's forces controlled the entire northern coast. The remaining Japanese forces, numbering in the tens of thousands, were scattered throughout the interior, cut off, starving, militarily irrelevant. They would continue to die in the jungle for another year, but they no longer mattered strategically. The statistics tell a story of complete victory. American forces had advanced over 1,500 miles in less than 2 years. They'd conducted dozens of amphibious landings, each one more sophisticated than the last. They'd established air bases that put Allied bombers within range of the Philippines, Borneo, and even Japan itself. They destroyed or neutralized over 170,000 Japanese soldiers while suffering roughly 14,000 killed in action. The casualty ratio was unprecedented. For every American killed, roughly 12 Japanese soldiers died. And while some of those Japanese deaths came in combat, the majority came from MacArthur's strategy of bypass and starvation. It was warfare reduced to its most fundamental level: cut off the enemy's supplies and let nature do the rest. The human cost on the Japanese side was almost incomprehensible. Entire regiments ceased to exist. Units that had entered New Guinea at full strength, confident and well-equipped, dissolved into scattered bands of starving men who eventually just lay down and died. Japanese soldiers wrote final letters that would never be delivered, buried them in the jungle and waited for death. Some carved final messages into trees, statements of loyalty to the emperor that would be discovered decades later by researchers. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese forces was devastating. They'd been taught that Japanese soldiers were superior, that Bushido and fighting spirit would overcome any material disadvantage. The New Guinea campaign shattered that belief. They'd been outfought, outmaneuvered, and outsmarted by the supposedly soft Americans. The loss of face, the destruction of their carefully constructed mythology of invincibility, was in some ways worse than the physical defeat. For American forces, the New Guinea campaign was transformative. Units that had arrived as inexperienced replacements departed as elite jungle fighters. They'd learned lessons that would be applied in every subsequent Pacific campaign. The tactics developed in New Guinea would be used in the Philippines, in Okinawa, in the planning for the invasion of Japan itself. Individual soldiers carried the scars of New Guinea for the rest of their lives. They'd seen things that couldn't be unseen, done things that couldn't be undone. They'd killed at close range, seen friends die in horrible ways, survived conditions that should have killed them. Many would suffer from what we now call PTSD, though in those days it was just called combat fatigue or, more dismissively, shell shock. But they'd also proven something important. They'd proven that American soldiers, given proper training, leadership, and support, could fight and win in the world's harshest environments against a fanatical enemy. They'd proven that Blamey's assessment was not just wrong but spectacularly wrong. They'd proven that American adaptability, American innovation, and American industrial might could overcome any tactical disadvantage. The irony of Blamey's original statement wasn't lost on anyone. The Australians had fought bravely in New Guinea, and their contributions shouldn't be minimized. But it was American forces that had conducted the decisive operations, that had advanced the furthest, that had inflicted the most devastating defeats on Japanese forces. The general who'd laughed at American softness had been forced to watch as those same Americans achieved victories that exceeded anything Australian forces had accomplished. MacArthur, never one for false modesty, made sure the world knew what had been accomplished. His communiques emphasized American achievements, sometimes to the point of minimizing Australian contributions. This created tensions between American and Australian forces that would persist throughout the war. But MacArthur didn't care about diplomatic niceties. He cared about results, and the results spoke for themselves. The New Guinea campaign also revealed something darker about modern warfare, its industrial nature. MacArthur had won not just through superior tactics but through overwhelming material superiority. American forces had access to endless supplies of ammunition, food, medical care, and replacements. Japanese forces, their supply lines cut, had none of these things. The outcome was determined as much by logistics as by courage or skill. This lesson would be applied even more ruthlessly in subsequent campaigns. At Peleliu, American forces would suffer high casualties, taking an island of dubious strategic value, leading to questions about MacArthur's judgment. At Leyte, American forces would return to the Philippines, fulfilling MacArthur's famous promise but at tremendous cost. At Okinawa, the final battle before the planned invasion of Japan, casualties on both sides would reach horrific levels. But New Guinea remained the campaign where the pattern was established, where American forces learned to fight a new kind of war. It was where soft American soldiers became hardened veterans, where inexperienced commanders became skilled tacticians, where American industrial might was first fully unleashed against Japanese forces, where the myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. The Japanese soldiers who died in New Guinea rarely received proper burials. Their bodies rotted in the jungle, were scattered by scavengers, were absorbed back into the earth. In Japan, families received terse notifications that their sons or husbands had died gloriously for the emperor. The reality that they'd starved to death in a fetid swamp or died of disease in a forgotten valley was never mentioned. After the war, recovery teams attempted to locate remains and provide proper burials. They found scattered bones, rusted equipment, personal effects that families had sent to sons who would never receive them. In some areas, the jungle had reclaimed everything, leaving no trace that 170,000 men had died there. It was as if they'd simply vanished from history. For American veterans, returning home brought its own challenges. How do you explain to people who'd never left the United States what it was like to fight in New Guinea? How do you describe heat so intense it felt like breathing through wet wool? How do you convey the terror of jungle combat, where the enemy could be anywhere and everywhere? How do you make people understand what it meant to watch friends die of diseases that had been eliminated in America decades ago? Most didn't try. They came home, used the GI Bill to get educations or start businesses, married, had children, and tried to forget. But New Guinea never fully left them. In quiet moments they'd remember. The sounds, the smells, the faces of men who died beside them. The knowledge that they'd survived when so many hadn't, and the guilt that came with that knowledge. The campaign's strategic significance cannot be overstated. By neutralizing Japanese forces in New Guinea, MacArthur had protected Australia from invasion, secured the southern flank of Allied operations in the Pacific, and created the conditions for the liberation of the Philippines. Every subsequent Allied victory in the Pacific built on foundations laid in New Guinea's jungles. And it had all started because one Australian general had laughed at American soldiers, had dismissed them as too soft for jungle warfare. That laughter had been answered not with words but with actions. With 1,500 miles of conquered territory. With dozens of successful amphibious landings. With 170,000 enemy dead. With a campaign that military historians would study for generations as an example of how to wage war with maximum efficiency and minimum friendly casualties. Blamey's laugh had echoed through military headquarters in early 1942. By 1945 that laugh seemed absurd, almost quaint. The Americans hadn't just proven they could handle jungle warfare. They'd revolutionized it, created new tactics and strategies that would influence military doctrine for decades. They'd taken Blamey's challenge and turned it into one of the most complete victories in military history. The soldiers who'd fought in New Guinea rarely spoke about Blamey's original assessment. They didn't need to. Their actions spoke louder than any words. They'd been tested in the harshest conditions imaginable and had emerged victorious. They'd proven that American soldiers weren't soft. They were adaptable, innovative, and when pushed to their limits, absolutely devastating. In the end, New Guinea became a graveyard for Japanese ambitions in the Southwest Pacific. The 170,000 soldiers who died there represented not just individual tragedies but the collapse of Japan's defensive strategy. They'd committed massive forces to hold territory they believed was crucial, and MacArthur had simply bypassed that territory, rendering those forces irrelevant and leaving them to die slow deaths in the jungle. It was brutal. It was efficient. And it was exactly what MacArthur had promised when he decided to prove Blamey wrong. The Americans weren't too soft for jungle warfare. They were too smart to fight it the way everyone expected. They'd adapted, innovated, and ultimately dominated a campaign that was supposed to break them. And in doing so, they'd helped turn the tide of the Pacific War, transforming what looked like certain defeat in early 1942 into inevitable victory by 1945.